For many years, the spend on wages for public servants has been the single largest component of government's consolidated expenditure. In 2019 and 20 alone, the government shelled out 623.8 billion to pay public servants. For more on this story, we have Labour analyst Johnny Goldberg. A very good morning or good day to you, Johnny. Thank you so much for making the time to talk to us today.
Thank you very much. Good morning to you and your listeners.
Minister Mboweni's hard stance on a wage freeze for public servants has many of the workers frustrated. Does this not follow on the conversation that's been taking place about a bloated salary bill, government's bloated salary bill, outside of the COVID-19 conversation?
Yes, I think if you see 41% of the revenue goes to paying civil service, I think there needs to be something done about that growing bill. The unfortunate part of it is it's part of a 3-year agreement, and it's the last year of the agreement that's not been implemented. So I think it's unfortunate for collective bargaining because stability is created through these 3-year agreements. And so the non-implementation, for whatever technicality, is a bit of a blow to longer-term agreements. And as you see today in the Sunday Times, trade unions saying that the 3-year agreement's already out of the question, and they'll be going for year-on-year agreements. That means basically you'll be negotiating in one season, out the next season, because you just concluded one negotiation, you're going to be into the next. But I think there's a compromise potentially on the table. We'll discuss that just now. Okay,
let's talk about the effects of COVID-19, how it's affected everyone, and essentials like petrol and medical aid expected to increase, only adding to the frustration of workers. What conversation is being held here?
Well, I think there's an expectation from every worker, every person earning a salary, to get some type of inflation adjustment to keep one head of inflation. So if we talk about inflation running around the 3% level, then one would expect that. And the agreement, the third-year agreement, was inflation plus 1%. So I think the first thing that COVID has produced is, I think, increases above inflation are going to be very difficult to get for any particular worker in the South African economy. And I think we've got to get that reality. For many years, and the bloating of salaries, not only in the civil service, but throughout South Africa, has been because we've had inflation plus agreements. I think we're going to have a couple of years of inflation-related agreements. And the bloating of the civil servants is not a consequence of a 3-year deal. It's a consequence of giving CPI plus increases. And it's a consequence of having inefficiencies within the state system. And again, I think some of the trade unions are correct. There's huge inefficiencies in respect of procurement, corruption, parastatals. We see PRASA appointing and getting rid of a CEO within the space of 6 months. I don't know what that's going to cost in respect of litigation. So I think the trade unions are 100% correct around the state inefficiency. But you can't have a 41% of your revenue going to civil servants in terms of wages. That is unsustainable, and that needs to be addressed. And that's not addressed with not following through on a 1-year agreement. Again, I suppose the compromise, if I was negotiating or mediating, I'd be saying COVID-19 produced the Disaster Management Act. There was a freeze, like in the steel sector, in the private steel sector. That's mature bargaining for the 2020 year. And to my mind, maybe one's got to say, well, the 3rd-year agreement should be implemented this year, take a 0% last year and negotiate another 3-year agreement on the base of some CPI increase, with a restructuring taking place in the civil service. Because the restructuring, where you don't make appointments that are unnecessary, you restructure and make more efficiencies, you'll get a huge saving on that 41%.
How practical is the threat to strike under lockdown conditions?
It's an interesting question. It's a very good question. Some citizens will say, well, it might not make any difference. But I think that's really, really harsh. Because as we know, some civil servants have been working extremely hard during the lockdown environment. Just look at the nurses and the essential services in respect. I think for me as a South African citizen and an advisor in this space, I think what has been unfair is that private sector workers have not got paid when they couldn't work, where a lot of the public sector workers still got paid while they couldn't work. And I think that's unfair. I think that debate needs to be had too. But the public sector workers who did, those people legitimately deserve an increase, potentially a bonus. But the people who didn't work, not through any fault of their own, private sector workers, again, not through any fault of their own, didn't get paid. And I think that's the imbalance in the system. And that needs to be corrected. We all need to share in the pain of a pandemic that came, and we were not the cause of the pandemic. So I think that is something that needs to be negotiated, debated in the forthcoming negotiations.
Do you have suggestions? Are there other ways that Minister Mboweni can deal with the government debt? You heard him during delivering his address saying, we owe a lot of people a lot of money. Is the wage freeze the only option, even after the impact of COVID-19, according to you?
No, I think the public service needs to be restructured entirely. And I think through that, with people retiring, people leaving, I think you'll get the restructuring you'll need to bring that 41% quite down. And you're quite correct, is 20 cents in each rand that we spend goes to debt repayment, and that's unsustainable, because we'd want 10 or 15 cents of that rand going into social infrastructure, to social services and building infrastructure, which this country dearly needs. Because unless we maintain the infrastructure, there's no ways we can continue to support international businesses and international operations. We need to maintain the infrastructure, improve it and better it, so we can be cost competitive. Because for overseas manufacturers in South Africa, the biggest cost is logistics, and we need to sort out those logistics costs. And the only way you can do that is continually build great IDZs, like the Kucha port, etc., are a great example of what we did many, many years ago, creating infrastructure that produced us wonderful returns today.
You were saying at the beginning of our conversation that there might be a solution in sight. What did you mean?
Yeah, for me, I would be negotiating or mediating a position where maybe for the 2020 year we should take a wage freeze, and effectively we should renegotiate a new 3-year agreement, maybe implementing the 3rd year of the agreement in this year, 2021, and talking about inflation-related increases. Because I think if an employer cannot give inflation-related increases, then there's a problem, and there needs to be restructuring. And I think together with that agreement, there needs to be a commitment to saying restructuring efficiencies. We live in the digital world. There are a whole range of processes that the state does that can be digitalized, that doesn't necessarily need the kind of person power that we currently have. So as people resign, as people retire, you don't replace those people, you make that more efficient in the system. And again, the sorry part of the debate, we have part of the civil service that is working extremely hard during COVID, and the other part of the civil service that's resting their laurels. They're at home and have been at home for the large part of this last year and still getting paid. And I think that's unfair.
Yeah. You know, Johnny, when we talk about inflation-related increases, is that even a conversation in a non-growth time in our economic history?
I think it's a very interesting point, but the expectation from an employee is, with your increases going up in medical aid, food and fuel, et cetera, the expectation is always going to be to try and stay ahead of inflation. So if we're not being able to meet that bar, and there are many industries, there are many organizations that can't meet that should get a 0% increase, then effectively, then you can implement it. But that's got to be exceptional circumstances. I think the unexceptional circumstance that happened for 20 years in this country is CPI plus increases. In some sectors, last year they implemented the 2nd year of collective agreements where workers got CPI plus 4. That's unsustainable. Civil servants should get CPI increases and effectively restructure an efficient state, because the money we save could go into social services that are so desperately needed in South Africa. So instead of paying service inefficiency of civil service in a certain parts of it, of course, there might be parts that are efficient. I'm not trying to paint it all with the same brush, But the point is, the parts that are inefficient, we've got to be, as South African citizens, say we are wasting money, and that money could be going to millions and millions of people who really need the social services. That's the debate we should be having openly and honestly in South Africa. Instead of paying inefficient departments, let's get that money back and put it into good infrastructure and good, sustainable social services.
Yeah. Just in terms of the way forward, this fight that you're taking to the minister, what form will it take?
I think there's most probably going to be a strike. And again, your point was how well planned is a strike during COVID, because unfortunately we will experience a third wave in South Africa, where many of the departments will not be able to work or only be able to partially work, which has been the case for the last year. And then a strike will not be really effective. I think the parties need to sit down, as the Sunday Times editorial is saying this morning. The parties need to sit down and find a solution. And I think the solution is saying 2020 was an exceptional year. 2021 is going to be a tough year, but here's the compromise for 2021. Here's the total money that we spend. Where we make savings, then we can talk about inflation-related increases for 2022, 2023. But so long as we don't make savings of the 41% of every rand we have to spend, 41% of every rand we have to spend, then effectively the status quo is going to remain. Because in order to affect the savings that the Minister of Finance is talking about, 144 billion over 3 years, it assumes a 0% increase. I'm not so sure that is sustainable. I think what is sustainable is a restructuring of parts of the civil service of the state that requires restructuring to get efficiencies and to save costs. That 144 billion should come out of that, not necessarily out of a 0% increase.
When you look at the labor movement landscape in the country, are the unions ready to take on this fight? And do you get a sense of cohesion amongst labor unions?
I think there is cohesion amongst certain of the labor unions. I think our labor unions have never been as divided because you have different groupings that have formed over the last 3 years. And so to get cohesion is quite difficult. But I think of the larger unions in the country, I think there is a growing realism as to what is going to work and what's not going to work. Remember, the trade unions and their members face the brunt of the restructuring and the retrenchments in the private sector, not in the public sector just yet, and maybe some more restructuring needs to take place, as I've said, in the public sector. So I think unions are already realistic in regard to what is confronting us. And for me, it's creating, in the private sector, it's creating capital investments, foreign investments, and proper, truly world-class cars. So when we see an international launch of the C-Class Mercedes-Benz, and we see that's built in East London, that makes me extremely proud as a South African. Because not does it create jobs at that plant, but it creates a huge amount of downstream jobs, and we are exporting to the world market a quality product, and that happens across many motor firms within South Africa. And as South African, I'm very pleased about that. But the point is, we've got to build the infrastructure long term to ensure that we can maintain that over the next 20 years. The motor plan that we subscribe to with government as private sector is to export over 1 million cars. And that would be a great opportunity in South Africa. So I think that's where we've got to be talking. And the trade unions are straight on the same page as business in regard to those noble objectives. Government needs to support us in terms of infrastructure. And that's why I'm saying the more we can save on wasteful expenditure that's not needed, then the more we could spend it on infrastructure and more social nets that we need in this country to really cater for a number of people who have got limited opportunities. Because one thing COVID has done, it's made the poor even poorer. And we've got to accept that in South Africa, and we've got to cater for it in order to create a stable South Africa.
So when you have a conversation about salary increases, how do you juxtapose it to the conversation about growing unemployment in the country and a government that's seeking solutions to get its population employed and building the economy?
And again, it's an excellent question, because the honest, decent discussion's got to be, how do we create jobs? Well, foreign direct investment creates jobs. Superb motor vehicles exported to the world and all the components, and raising the level of localization of components creates jobs. But there's, again, if you bank and start doing great infrastructure, remember our infrastructure has decayed. We have huge problems in municipalities with infrastructure. We start investing in that instead of spending in areas that is not good spend, wasteful expenditure. Then effectively we start creating jobs. Again, it's contentious. But to my mind, maybe there's certain areas in the country, if we want to compete in shirts, in textiles, and in clothing, maybe those areas we should be testing on a piece rate, pay per piece worked. So effectively, person gets paid, maybe some minimum conditions, but very few, but effectively gets paid per shirt that they've actually sewed. Maybe that's where you can compete with other Eastern countries where we import all these clothes from. Those are the kind of initiatives and debates that need to take place between government, business, and trade unions. And I want to just add that I think in COVID, the working arrangement that's happened between government, business, and labor is unprecedented. It's brilliant. We've achieved some unbelievable things together as collective parties. The whole payout in respect to the COVID TERS payment in UIF is a direct product of negotiating between those three parties. And that, to a large extent, has saved many jobs. It's saved many businesses, and it's put a little bit of money on the table for people who've really suffered.
Let's thank you for your time today. We hope to talk to you further as developments unfold in this conversation.
Thank you very much to you and your listeners.
Johnny Goldberg is a labor analyst and talking to us about the displeasure of workers as the Minister of Finance announced further salary freezes going forward. Of course, it still remains a conversation.